Hey, what's going on? This is Eric Olson, and I'm coming to you from my micro studio in Brooklyn, New York. And today I wanted to talk about my new computer that I built from the ground up. It's a 4K editing beast. In fact, that's what I call it, the Beast. And it can just tear through 4K footage like butter. That's what I keep telling people. It's already built, as you can see, the very nice AMD processor there, spinning around and making all these neat colors. So in this video, I am just going to go through the different components and maybe give you some ideas of how you can build your own editing computer. And we'll just go through it, and I'll talk a little bit about the components that I chose and why. Okay, so first of all, you might have noticed that the case for this computer is smaller and kind of a different shape than you typically see for computer cases. And the reason I got this is that I have a very small space and I needed the tower to sit on a bookshelf that I have, and I didn't want it taking up a bunch of floor space. So the case is the Corsair Carbide Series A240, and it's a very nice case. It looks very nice, kind of reminds me of the Borg from Star Trek, for those of you that are old enough to remember that. But the great thing about it is it has a lot of ventilation. There's all kinds of places for air to flow through. And so for a small case like this, I think that's really important so that your components don't overheat, which can affect the performance. So the case itself has 3 fans. The motherboard I chose, unfortunately, only has 2 slots to connect power. Maybe there's a way around that. If you know, let me know in the comments. And so there's 2 fans, one on top, one in the front, and that's moving the air through. One other thing about it is that it has a neat plexiglass side here, and so you can actually look in there and see the very colorful AMD processor fan working hard and keeping your processor cool. So the next thing I'll talk about is the motherboard. And to be honest, I don't think there's a huge difference in motherboards at this point. They're all relatively inexpensive, and they're probably all going to work for what you want to do. If you are building using an AMD processor, which I'll talk about in a minute, then you need to make sure that your motherboard is compatible with AMD processors and not Intel. So for this build, I picked the Asus B450M gaming motherboard. By the way, I'll link to all of these in the description, and just note that those are actually affiliate links, so they're I do get a bit of a kickback if you end up buying the components that way. I have no connection to any of these companies or any of this gear, so these are just things that I found and are working well for me. Anyway, so yeah, this is the Asus tough gaming motherboard. It's tough, and I guess it's tough because some of the connections are, the ports in the back are reinforced, so they can take a lot of, sort of wear and tear of plugging things in and things like that. So as I mentioned, I decided to go with the AMD Ryzen processor, Ryzen 7. The model is the 2700X, which I think is the latest model that they have out. And it's an 8-core, 16-thread processor, if that means anything to you. It's very fast. And it's quite a bit cheaper than the equivalent Intel processor, which is why I chose it, trying to stay in a budget of around $1,000. And I've been very happy with it. The one thing that I will say is when you're installing this processor, be very careful, because unlike Intel processors where the pins of the motherboard go into the processor, this actually have pins that go down, and you have to be very careful getting them into the slot on the motherboard. And actually, when I was installing it, I wasn't aware of this. I ended up bending the pins, which are these little gold pins, and 2 of them ended up breaking off. I was able to kind of realign the other ones, and the end result is that the computer still worked, which was great, but there's some little buggy things that happen. I don't have an HDMI out from the motherboard. Fortunately, the graphics card has 4 HDMI outs, so it wasn't a big deal. And what's the other thing? Oh, sometimes it boots the BIOS, it hangs up on the BIOS and I have to reset. So these aren't, these aren't the end of the world, and the computer's still working fine for my purposes, so I just went ahead and just ran with it. All right, so the next thing I'll talk about is the power supply. In this case, I just went with what was recommended to me by the sales floor person at Micro Center in Brooklyn. So this is a 650 watt power supply. It's gold rated, which I guess means it's more efficient. And if you live in a place that has very expensive electricity, like I do, thank you, Con Edison, this is gonna, I guess, save you money over time. That's yet to be seen, but we'll have to find out. Also, just of note is this is a modular power supply. So I guess if it's not modular, you kind of have to live with all the wires that are hanging out of it. You can't take them in it. You can't take them off. But for this one, you can, and you just don't have, your case ends up not being as crowded with stuff, cables that you don't need. Anyways, so that's power. Okay, so we've got a motherboard, we've got a power supply, we've got a processor. The next thing is we need a hard drive to run our applications from. So in this case, I decided to go with a solid state drive. This is kind of the new best practice, I guess. And the advantage of solid state drives is they're very fast, and if you run your operating system from them, like Microsoft Windows for most people, that's it's going to boot up really fast, and that has proven to be true. So for my sort of system drive, I chose the Samsung 970 EVO. This is M.2 memory, so that means it just goes right into the motherboard. It's very tiny. In fact, it's not even the size of this package. It's crazy that this can fit 250 gigs on it. I chose 250 gigs. That should be sufficient to run, Premiere, After Effects, all the programs that I need to do my work. So that's the sort of system drive. So 250 gigs is not enough for me to for my media files. Sometimes, in some cases, I have 4K media files that are multiple gigs, and so 250 gigs would fill up really quick. Plus, you don't want to usually store your media on the same drive as your system drive. That's just another best practice that makes your system a bit faster. So so for my sort of media storage drive where I'm going to put all my project files, I also picked an SSD. This is a 500 gig SSD. It's also Samsung and very fast. It just connects to the same SATA port that your platter type hard drives, the big heavy ones, would plug into. And there's not much else I can say about it. That's the Samsung 500 gig. And then I also included one other drive. This is the Kingston 120 gig solid state drive. So this is a separate drive where I'm using as sort of a render drive. This is where your render files for After Effects and your preview files for Premiere are gonna go. And for this drive, I really went for cheap. I think this drive was like, it says on here, $35. It might even been a little bit cheaper. And the reason that I chose this was that I really don't care if this drive goes down, because these are just temporary sort of intermediary files. There's no real information that would be lost in these files. The Premiere or After Effects can just regenerate them. And so I was just saving money with this, but it's 120 gigs, so that's pretty good. I'm if I was not trying to stick within this $1,000 budget, I might have gone with a larger drive. I mean, you can't really have too much room for those types of files, but this works for my purposes. So another important component of your computer is the RAM memory, and that's so in this case I just went for kind of the most RAM I could get for my buck. This is G-Skill Rip Jaws. It sounds very cool, and actually the RAM sort of looks like little I don't know, jaws or knives or something like that. And this is, I think, about $300, but it's 32 gigs of RAM. And so if you're doing any kind of like heavy graphics work or something like that, you know, where it's very intense, you do want to have, I think 32 gigs is probably the minimum that you want to have. I think this motherboard I have can support up to 64 gigs, but that was out of budget. So anyways, Rip Jaws looks cool, and pretty good price. And then finally, this is the graphics card that I went with. If you didn't know, Premiere and Adobe After Effects have a, they can make use of your graphics card as sort of another way to render video files and effects and things like that. So I went for a 4 GB card. This is a Gigabyte brand card, and it uses the NVIDIA GeForce GTX 1050 Ti. So there's the weird thing about graphics cards is that a lot of them are NVIDIA. They have NVIDIA chips or something inside of them, but you'll see a bunch of different brands. I picked one that was within budget. I think it was like a little bit under $200. And it seems to be working well. I would say with this card, it feels a little bit cheap in terms of how it's built. If you have a little more money in your budget, maybe you want to go with something that's a little sturdier. This felt very plasticky. All right, so as you can see, that's all the components that went into this computer build. Just a few words about performance. I've been using this for a couple weeks now. I'm very happy with it. I was editing on a modified gaming laptop before, and it worked really well, but I got into some projects that were using 4K footage and with effects and different layers, and it was just a little too much for that machine. So I decided that I would upgrade and just build a beast of a machine to tear through that 4K footage, and this machine has performed very, very well. You know, for basically around $1,200. You know, if you were going to buy a Mac or some other, you know, pre-built machine, you know, I don't know, probably for an iMac you're looking at like $4 grand, I think, for, you know, something with 32 gigs of RAM and all of that. So, you know, you're really getting like more bang for your buck if you build your own machine. And, you know, I think people are also a little intimidated by it. It's actually really not that difficult. I put this whole thing together basically with a screwdriver, and that's about it. And you just have to know where to pop the components in. There's usually cable, there's little connectors. There's tons of YouTube videos online. In fact, that's what I watched before I built this, and you know, to help you along the way and show you exactly how to build it. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I'm just starting this channel. I've been a video creator for, you know, upwards of 10 years, and I'm just would love to share the knowledge that I have with everybody and sort of share my processes and, you know, what I'm working on right now. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to my channel. Like the video. You can follow me on Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, whatever. Pick your poison. And if you have any questions, please let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. And that's it for this video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.